Thank you very much, Diana, Chair and fellows, and my wife Emma. It's a great pleasure, a great honour to be here this evening. And to introduce you, this first lecture will be talking mainly about methods and about sources that we have available to us, looking at the long age through the late antique Little Ice Age, the medieval climate anomaly, and into the era of the Little Ice Age, in inverted commas, down to about 1850. So, environmental history. Just a quick aside before I start properly. When I was interviewed in Stirling in 2002 for the post, I was waiting outside the room because we had to do presentations, first of all, to the assembled great and good of the then Department of History at Stirling. And two individuals who were later to become my colleagues went walking in. They shall remain nameless, but Michael Penman, sitting in the audience, knows who both are. And one turned rather querulously to the other and said, "What is this environmental history stuff?" To which the other one replied, "I'm not entirely sure, but it seems to have an awful lot to do with trees." And I'll leave it up to you by the end of the weekend to decide whether or not it has a lot to do with trees. The other key thing I will say to you this evening is the slides, the images, are wallpaper. They have got some additional words on it, but they're there basically to break up the monotony of listening to me as I control the room for the next period of time. So anyway, without much further ado. According to the website of Visit Scotland, the agency that promotes the wonders of Scotland to domestic and international tourists, our environment, or landscapes and nature as it is labelled on the site, is one of the country's greatest assets and attractions. It is a land replete with natural wonders that is laid out for visitors, of towering mountains, glittering lochs, dense woodlands, and miles upon miles of golden beaches that form landscapes and natural scenery that really will take your breath away. You're invited to tour the rolling hills and lush farmland of the lowlands, or drive through deep glens surrounded by mountains in the highlands. Uncover magnificent and coastal features of the west and explore the atmospheric royal settings of the east. For the adventurous, you can head into one of our dark sky parks, or spots where you can marvel at the sparkling night sky, dip your toes into our crisp seawater, wander around one of the many glistening freshwater lochs, or venture out into the wilderness to see if you can catch the northern lights dancing in the sky. Here, in a few sentences, is the delight, the wonderful variety, astonishing diversity, and seeming timelessness of the land and environment of one small country captured in a handful of breathless lines. It is an attractive vision, almost idealized in its presentation of juxtaposed docility and wildness, like the imagined landscapes of some Italian fresco. Look a little deeper, however, and questions begin to form. Where are the people in this landscape? Apart from the lowlands, lush farmland, or perhaps those enigmatic atmospheric royal settings of the east, it is a wilderness with which we are presented, of glens, mountains, lochs, and woodlands, empty of other life, human and non-human, and awaiting your arrival as intrepid adventurers. There is almost nothing in the pitch to suggest that what you will find is far from being in any sense wild nature or a wilderness, and only the barest of hints that what you will see is the product of countless millennia of continuously changing global climate patterns and the interplay of around 9 millennia of human interaction with and transformation of almost every part of the land and waters in and surrounding what we now know as Scotland. Far from being anything near to pristine nature or in any sense wilderness, all of what we see today is part of a complex cultural construction. Its layers upon layers of cultural landscapes are manufactured by millennia of interaction between humans and the wider environment through which they moved, altered and adapted to deliver the means to sustain them. Its complexity is staggering in the multiplicity of layers of alteration and input created by shifting economic and social conditions, population levels, management fashions, and, of course, climate. When there is no broad recognition of this reality of layering amongst the many stakeholders who are trying to shape public perceptions of the nature of Scotland's landscape, It is perhaps unfair to single out what is, after all, a successful promotional pitch designed to lure tourists to our country. Nevertheless, it serves as a useful introduction to the popular myth-making and academic neglect that for centuries has moulded perceptions of Scotland's history, its people, but most powerfully of the land itself, in the minds of audiences at home and abroad. Importantly, these are the myths which, as factoids, are being repackaged and redeployed by participants in the multifaceted current discourse concerning the future shape and content of Scotland's landscapes and environment. The airbrushing of humanity's presence and impacts from the picture presented in this marketing material, unintentionally reflecting one consequence of generations of population clearance and emigration, and more recently the actual physical removal of such evidence, is a contributor to what has been labelled as a syndrome of shifting baselines. This syndrome has been described as a situation created through our individual internalising of, quote, the ecological impoverishment in our science, culture and institutions, end quote, that perpetuates a continually moving picture where each generation assumes the nature they experienced in their youth to be normal and unwittingly accepts the decline and damage of the generations before. We are, however, in a dangerous place where steps to reverse that ecological impoverishment results in a cultural impoverishment through a willful, self-conscious act of social amnesia that obliterates and then denies past human contributions to the creation of landscapes that evidence our ancestors' struggles to subsist and succeed in often hostile and inhospitable places. A long educational tradition of teaching the history of improvement and enlightenment in schools and the ingrained popular knowledge of the Highland clearances has, however, preconditioned some awareness of moments of significant change, whether packaged as positive or negative in their effects and their enduring physical legacies. Many people know of the transformation of the rural landscape that generations of historical tradition tell us started in the mid-18th century, reached its zenith on the eve of the First World War, and whose physical remains still largely define the patterns into which the land is divided and the uses to which it is put, or the consequences of industrialisation, deindustrialisation and urbanisation since 1800. These are all processes that altered the face of the land, creating agricultural landscapes or engulfing them beneath expanding towns and cities, which have left profound scars that are unmistakable evidence of massive human intervention in the relatively recent past. Fewer people, however, perceive the expanses of emptiness that are to be found in many upland districts, not only in the Highlands, as anthropogenic constructions and of equally recent creation. Yet, whether it is the rounded grassy hillsides of the borders or the heather-clad moors and mountains of the Highlands, the landscapes we see today and the usually ecologically degraded environments they comprise are the cultural products largely of 18th or 19th century social and economic systems in which sheep and deer were valued more than people. For many contemporary commentators, the point of transition that delivered these socio-economic systems is the critical baseline, dividing understanding of Scotland's current environment into a pre-improvement era of nature's abundance and a post-improvement situation of continuous and continuing loss. What few acknowledge, however, is that their baseline is arbitrary, reflecting neither the millennia of subtle and not so subtle shifts that have been powered by climatic, pathogenic and human agencies, nor that the systems which brought about the changes they identify were transitory and gave way to a slow-moving landslide of consequences with variable and still unfolding modern outcomes. That slow-moving landslide is our unconscious experience of shifting baselines, or the condition that environmental humanities professor Robin Dixon has labelled slow violence, that can be found embedded within the, quote, slowly unfolding environmental catastrophes, end quote, of climate change, long-term pollution, or degraded land across timescales that render it impossible to attribute direct blame to any individual or agency. To an extent, it excuses our relative blindness to the reality that environments are not static, but exist in constant flux. rolling back the flow to some arbitrary, notionally pristine state, as sought for in even the most carefully planned program of restoration ecology, at best resets the dial on the change process, but how it evolves from there will be determined by wholly different climatic, environmental, and anthropogenic variables than in the past. The focus of this lecture series is not on where our human relationships with the environment in Scotland is heading, but on how the roots of our present conditions were formed in the era of two little ice ages and the intervening medieval climate anomaly from circa 500 to circa 1850 CE. I aim in the course of these 6 papers to introduce you to an environmental history of Scotland, not a history of Scotland's environment. We will explore human relationships with what we will still tend to set apart from ourselves through that most basic of culturally constructed heuristics that we use to negotiate our experience of the world through which we move, the Durkheimian nature and culture dichotomy, as the natural environment. Such environmental histories, that is, histories in which, as Richard Hoffman has expressed it, nature matters, explore the myriad interrelationships and dependencies between humans and the rest of the world in which we live. As a sub-discipline, it started to emerge as a distinct strand in historical writing around the same time we awoke to the immensity of the negative impact that we were having on the world. From the atom bomb to overpopulation, pollution and forever chemicals, to resource exhaustion, societal disintegration and ecological collapse, academics in the 1960s saw a horrifying prospect of imminent apocalypse and responded with an outpouring of existential anxiety that questioned how we had arrived at this place and how we might survive the inevitable crises to come. Ironically, many of the major advances in that understanding were triggered by research programs in the Arctic, funded chiefly but not exclusively by the US military, which had the overarching aim of better understanding of the survivability of profound global change, for example, through nuclear war, but which began to deliver hard evidence for past global climate change. The most significant advances, however, came with the European Science Foundation-funded Greenland Ice Core project, or GRIP as it was known, which ran from 1988 to 1995, and subsequent projects which tested and expanded upon GRIP's findings. Archaeologists and historians, especially those working in the North Atlantic, responded quickly to this new data to explain in terms of climate change the early successes of ventures like the Norse colonization of Iceland and Greenland and the near collapse or total failure of these colonies later in the Middle Ages, as popularized by Jared Diamond. If we could understand how and why that happened, might we not better understand the kinds of challenges that humanity could face as climate change and especially global warming accelerated? For a country located on the northwestern edge of Europe, backed by the North Atlantic and dependent for its relatively benign climatic conditions on the circulation of oceanic waters and atmospheric pressure systems, the precarity of regimes in Scotland that depended on the continuity of those mechanisms was immediately evident in the new data from Greenland. It is important to reflect on the fact that until the data from GRIP and the subsequent GISP2 projects started to percolate beyond the climatological community, indeed until around 25 years ago, almost all history, not just Scottish history, was still written from an entirely human perspective. Archaeology was already moving ahead of historians in its embracing by the 1970s of evidence for ancient environmental conditions, paleoenvironmental data, that could enrich understanding of lifestyles and practices for which there was otherwise no written record. Its focus was almost wholly anthropocentric, however, being concerned with what such evidence might tell us about the arrival and spread of agriculture, prehistoric woodland decline, or the diversity of foraged and farmed resources exploited by a community, with reflection on climate change and its potential contribution to some of the changes evident in the archaeological record only developing gradually through the 1980s. Already by the 1990s, that perspective had switched entirely to the point that climate had come to be recognized as one of the most significant influences on human cultural development. Many academic historians, however, were either oblivious to or dismissive of the potential for non-textual forms of data to expand understanding of processes that they otherwise could barely glimpse in their documents. That, however, is not to say that there were no developments in historical methodologies. Nevertheless, by the late 1970s, while some scholars adopted a top-down or bottom-up social approach or attempted to adopt a gendered perspective, historiography still largely followed the human gaze. Most remained driven by textual evidence, or occasionally oral record, giving the most cursory of nods to other forms of evidence. For the most part, too, it considered the world in which we lived as a mere backdrop to political events and economic developments. That world, furthermore, was a relative constant that changed only when we humans decided that it needed to be improved upon or in some way modified to deliver more of what we wanted from it, and where a capitalized nature was an essentially passive force that impinged little on human decision-making. That somewhat dismissive view needs tempering. For from the 1950s, long before GRIP had been conceived, growing scientific awareness of a far more complex interplay between humans and the planetary system in which we live had begun to permeate some areas of historical thinking. In fields like historical geography and climatology, researchers were led by the new data and began to advance alternative models of how larger and more powerful forces, climate change or pandemic and panzootic disease, influenced human experience and daily life. At the forefront in Britain was the historical climatologist Hubert Lamb, whose research by the mid-1960s had evidenced episodes of climatic warming and cooling, whose effects on medieval England's largely rural society were likely to have been profound. He saw the most pronounced warming episode as extending from the later 11th to mid-13th centuries, while a major cooling appeared to start in the 15th and end in the 19th centuries. His theories on the warming episode struck a chord with English medieval economic historians, led by Michael Poston. Poston's depressingly neo-Malthusian thesis of population growth triggered by the benign conditions of what we now style the medieval climate anomaly, or MCA for short, driving peasant land hunger, resulting in overpopulation and soil fertility depletion, leading in turn to yield decline, harvest failure, famine, and mass mortalities, brought a new focus on the science within natural processes upon which human society depended. Unfortunately, Lamb's use of the extensive surviving Southern and Midlands English manorial accounts, which documented expansion of the area under cultivation, population figures, yield levels, and stock numbers, coupled with narrative sources for weather trends and his own meteorological models, could not be replicated for Northern England, let alone Scotland. The result was that beyond a disappointingly meagre handful of generalized statements about population trends and human expansion, the revolution in English historiography on the interplay of climate and human population had almost no equivalent in the work of the generation of Scottish historians led by Barrow, Duncan, and Nicholson. Largely as a consequence of that perceived lack of equivalent data, as late as the 1980s, the otherwise excellent major overview studies of Scotland could still be written from an entirely anthropocentric perspective, in which almost every determinant in the socio-economic and political evolution of the Scottish state was founded in human action. But the steady increase in availability of scientific data to provide proxies for other forms of traditional historical evidence meant that the delayed revolution was coming, spearheaded from the 1960s in social history and from the late 1990s in environmental history by the work of one scholar, Christopher Smout, our greatest living Scottish historian. In the decade following his retirement from St Andrews, a prodigious output of new research saw Professor Smout introduce us to the potential of environmental history as a tool to better understand human interrelationships with and interdependence on this land on which we live. Despite that output, however, and even more so despite a sustained effort at accessible communication of the research by the wave of scholars who have built on Professor Smout's foundational work, both professional and popular awareness of the complex histories that underlie many of our current environmental issues remain shallow and fragmentary. Myth and myth understanding have thrived as new audiences have become engaged and enraged by the ecological loss with which they are confronted, and the seeming indifference or incapacity of governments, agencies, and the public at large to respond effectively to the continuing slow violence they see. Much of their outrage is based on misunderstanding and is often misdirected. Most is driven by the factoids distributed by usually well-meaning but ill-informed activists whose perception of the past has been framed by the often vivid but ultimately fantastical word imagery of 19th century authors rather than by the cooler, carefully researched but often inaccessible findings of modern academics. Modern myth-making, however, has directed its gaze much deeper into the human past in Scotland than the reach of the nation's recorded history, and it is there that the means to dismantle some of the most persistent of these distortions lie. Although these lectures cover only a span of 1,300 years, it is vital to recognise that an environmental history of Scotland does not simply span that historic era or commence with the earliest surviving written accounts relating to the geographical area occupied by the modern nation. Using different forms of non-textual record evidence, we can instead take an environmental history far deeper into what is conventionally labelled prehistory. Using climate proxy data, it is possible to synthesize an account of how over 200 generations of our predecessors shaped and were shaped by the environment through which they moved long before the era with which this lecture series is concerned. Exactly when the first human settlers arrived in Scotland will probably never be known, as millennia of intensive land use and modern urban sprawl has removed many places attractive to these first people. We can be sure that it was climate change that created the conditions that drew them north, starting a 10,000-year interaction that shaped the cultural artifact that is our modern landscape and its distinctive ecologies. Some studies, influenced by pessimistic views of human impacts on the environment as wholly negative, sought evidence to support suggestions that such transformations were as old as the earliest human presence in Scotland. Thus, it was argued that by around 8,000 BCE, significant anthropogenic interventions had changed the physical character of the land and the vegetation it supported, starting that slow landslide of change that has given rise to Scotland's regionally distinctive landscapes. With hindsight, we can recognise that there is an inherent danger in a deterministic interpretation being applied to such evidence, where the butterfly effect of an event that is perhaps only indirectly attributable to human action can be overblown into a proposition that from that one action flowed an inevitable trend that resulted in a negative outcome whose legacies remain with us today. In essence, an event, starting the cascade of slow violence whose still unfolding progress we witness today. In the flow country of northeast Sutherland and Caithness, for example, it was proposed in the 1990s that burning of vegetation was practiced by Mesolithic hunter-gatherer peoples who moved through the region around 9,000 years ago. That burning, it was suggested, impeded regeneration of woodland cover by tree species already at the limit of their geographical range, over 4 millennia before the arrival of the Neolithic peoples, whose cultural practices are traditionally identified as the trigger for the long, slow violence of woodland decline. Some archaeologists and paleoenvironmental specialists further suggested that this periodic burning contributed to the waterlogging that led to the development of the iconic peat wetlands of the flow country. Others have argued strongly that the two are unrelated and pointed to the very limited nature of the charcoal spreads claimed as evidence of extensive woodland or heathland burning. Most recent studies now reject anthropogenic causality in peat formation. Rather than being the unwanted end product of a human action, blanket peat spread is seen as, quote, an inevitable but rapid end stage to soil development in what was generally a cold, wet climate conducive to its growth, or as a consequence of past climatic change. What was once perceived as a manifestation of slow violence initiated by human agency is now presented as a primarily non-anthropogenic process in which humans played, at worst, a cameo role. So, what are these primarily non-anthropogenic forces that underlie such profound transformations of the environment upon which Scotland's human population depended? In the second half of the 20th century, there was growing scientific awareness of the extent to which major oceanic and atmospheric circulation systems drive prevailing weather patterns, and that even relatively minor adjustments to these systems can have potentially beneficial or catastrophic consequences for societies who develop their economic systems, agriculture, fisheries, and other forms of resource management on traditional environmental knowledge, or TEK, which was shaped during long phases of relatively stable conditions by close observation across generations of the rhythms of the seasons and patterns of weather. For us in the North Atlantic, the most important of the oceanic circulation systems is that known by the acronym AMOC, otherwise the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is the major system of oceanic currents that carry warm water from the tropics northwards into the North Atlantic. It works like a conveyor belt that is powered by differences in water density that arise from changes in temperature and salinity. When the water flows north, it gradually cools, but also sees some evaporation, which causes the salt content of the remaining water to increase. The low temperatures and high salt content cause the water to become denser. As the density increases, the dense water sinks into the ocean, several thousand meters beneath the surface, and begins to spread southwards. There, it begins to be drawn towards the surface, warm as it rises, and so starts a new circulation. But it is not solely the AMOC which has an effect on us, and we have become increasingly aware of the impact of the greatest global circulation system in the Pacific Ocean and its influence on weather patterns, even in the northeastern Atlantic. Most people are familiar with the El Niño-La Niña phenomenon by name, but less so with what it is and how it affects us. El Niño means the little boy in Spanish, and is derived from the name that fishermen on Peru's Pacific coast first used from the 1600s for periods of unusually warm water in the ocean that affected the migration of the shoals on which they depended. Its full name is El Niño de Navidad, because the warm water episode usually peaked in December. El Niño is now used to describe this episodic warming of sea surface temperature, which is concentrated normally in the Central East Equatorial Pacific. In Met Office terms, an El Niño is declared when, quote, sea temperatures in the tropical eastern Pacific rise 0.5 degrees C above the long-term average. El Niño is felt strongly in the eastern tropical Pacific with warmer than average weather. El Niño's counterpart is La Niña, or the girl. It is the term adopted by climatologists from the traditional name applied to the opposite side of the Pacific's temperature fluctuation. This is episodes of cooler than average sea surface temperature occurring in that same region of the equatorial Pacific. The conditions for declaring a La Niña event differ between various monitoring agencies, but it is generally accepted that during an event, surface temperatures might fall to 3 to 5 degrees C below average. This is generally experienced as cooler, drier than average weather in the tropical eastern Pacific. But it is not just the Pacific region that is affected by the El Niño-La Niña cycle. We now know that the cycle has global ramifications with often severe weather impacts in regions distant from the Pacific. For us in the northern British Isles, El Niño years are recognised as an important factor with the potential to increase the threat of colder winters. El Niño has been seen as a limiter on the development of tropical storms in the North Atlantic. By way of contrast, La Niña can enhance development of storm systems and cause increased rainfall in some regions, but droughts or cooler temperatures in others. As a note here, current monitoring suggests that summer 2024 will see a La Niña event, so get out the umbrellas. Neither the AMOC nor El Niño-La Niña function in isolation, but they're accompanied by major switches in atmospheric pressure systems and circulation. For AMOC, there is the North Atlantic Oscillation, and for El Niño-La Niña, there is El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, which is an irregular interannual cycle involving the oscillation of atmospheric pressure changes between the East and West tropical Pacific regions, and is now known to accompany both El Niña and La Niña episodes. The ENSO name is a reminder of the intimate interaction of atmosphere and ocean, which is an essential dimension of the weather-shaping processes they represent. Of the multiple examples of such systems interactions globally, ENSO is the single most dominant feature driving climate variability on year-to-year timescales across much of the planet. It is, from a historical perspective, essential to recognise that these systems are also not modern developments, although their increasing dynamism and unpredictability is linked to anthropogenic factors. In recent experience, these events are associated with widespread changes in global climate systems that can last several months, sometimes recurring year on year, and have been seen to lead to significant human impacts affecting everything from agriculture, good and bad harvests, and fish migration patterns. The physical infrastructures of buildings, roads and bridges, human and animal health, and, as we shall see tomorrow, provision of traditional sources of thermal energy. Here in the northern part of the British Isles, most direct weather impacts that affect us arise from the North Atlantic Oscillation, or NAO. This is the name applied to the changing relative relationships of the areas of atmospheric high pressure centred on the Azores, the so-called Azore High, and low pressure over Iceland, the so-called Icelandic Low. The interaction between these systems exert a strong influence on winter weather and climate patterns in Europe and North America, as it causes changes in the intensity and location of the North Atlantic jet stream, the flow of very fast winds high in the atmosphere that affect the movement of regions of low pressure. The Met Office describes the alternating states of the NAO as, quote, positive or high NAO phase, which represents a stronger than usual difference in pressure between the two regions. Winds from the west dominate, bringing warm air, while the position of the jet stream enables stronger and more frequent storms to cross the Atlantic. These support mild, stormy and wet winter conditions in northern Europe and the eastern USA. Conversely, northern Canada, Greenland and southern Europe are prone to cold and dry winter conditions. The negative or low NAO phase represents the reverse, with a weaker than usual difference in pressure. Winds from the east and northeast are more frequent, bringing with them cold air, while the adjusted position of the jet stream leads to weaker and less frequent storms. As a result, northwestern Europe is more likely to experience cold, calm and dry winters. How we see the effects of these phenomena on Scotland is founded on a combination of modelling based on different forms of climate proxy data, physical evidence from archaeological excavation, principally paleoenvironmental records, and the often qualitative data of surviving written records. Of the three climate episodes whose effects we will explore over the course of this weekend, the first, but probably least well known, is the Lalia, or Late Antique Little Ice Age. This phenomenon was a long-lasting cooling period that spanned the Northern Hemisphere, commencing in the second quarter of the 6th century and extending through the 7th century. In European terms, this is the Late Antique era, marking the final phase of the Classical era that had seen the flourishing of Greco-Roman culture, and it is the beginning of its transition into the Middle Ages. It followed a long episode of more benign conditions known as the Roman Warm period, which had started to decline from the 3rd century, and its onset is linked to the cumulative cooling impact of three major volcanic eruptions in 5356, 53940, and 547 of volcanoes whose locations have not yet been determined with certainty. Historic records from across Eurasia reference atmospheric phenomena, including a hazy or weakened sun in 536, which has been linked to the global circulation of aerosol particulates from the eruption of a dust cloud in the high atmosphere. As modern analyses of the consequences of such phenomena show, for example, from Laki in 1783, Tambora in 1815, Krakatoa in 1883, Mount St. Helens in 1980, or Punutabu in 1991, the 536 event potentially delivered a global cooling of 2 degrees C, sufficient to cause failure of cultivation across the northern hemisphere and suppress grass growth to the point that traditional grazing regimes failed to deliver the biomass necessary to sustain flocks and herds. In my second lecture, I will consider some of the possible responses to the cooler and wetter conditions of this era for the human population in Scotland. There was no abrupt transition from the Lalia into a clearly defined new climate epoch. There was instead a fading of its more extreme conditions into a new pattern that was more benign for settled human cultures dependent on an arable agricultural regime. This era of recovery has no specific label, but it can be seen as spanning the 8th to 10th centuries, towards the end of which the climate record begins to settle into another new pattern that heralded the start of the MCA, or medieval climate anomaly, also known as the medieval warm period. Although there is a long-established tradition of portraying this as the golden age of medieval Scotland, a time, in the words of 15th century chronicler Andrew of Winton, of wine and wax, gammon and glee, it was not an era of seemingly endless barbecue summers, but it did herald in a long episode of generally warmer conditions to the North Atlantic, spanning the period from the mid-10th to mid-13th centuries. For Scotland, the MCA developed from the end of the 10th century through the 11th and peaked in the early 1200s, before declining rapidly in the 1250s and 1260s. Its long, stuttering tail saw profound instability and widely fluctuating temperatures and rainfall patterns, most extreme around an early 14th century episode referred to as the Dantean anomaly that, as we shall see in my second lecture, coincided with consecutive harvest failures across northern Europe. It is not yet a quarter of a century since Brian Fagan popularized the scientific concept that the period from the later 14th to mid-19th centuries had been what we now term a, in inverted commas, little ice age, with the label usually presented uncapitalized. Fagan was by no means the first to use the description, Francois Matthes having first employed the term in his 1939 report on the development and disappearance of glaciers in the Sierra Nevada of California. In the 60 years from Matthes to Fagan, it had been used in a capitalized form by geologists and climatologists to describe what they at first saw as a phase of marked deterioration in global weather patterns. But in the later 20th century, this global dimension was reassessed, and it is now understood as more of a North Atlantic, North European phenomenon that followed the milder and stabler MCA. For our present purposes, the LIA was a prolonged episode of regional cooling that was most pronounced in the Northern Hemisphere and the regions fringing the North Atlantic especially. Although Fagan traced its origins to an early 14th century episode of climatic instability, which will be touched on later, there is varying opinion on the dating of its inception. These range from later 14th to later 15th centuries, but consensus on its endpoint is that it occurred in the mid-19th century after a final phase of profound disturbance in the 1810s to the end of the 1840s, with that last decade seeing the absolute nadir of temperatures and extremes of drought and precipitation in 1848. It is important, however, to recognise that, like the MCA, it was not an episode of continuous departure from some norm. In the LIA's case, it was not a continuous era of depressed temperatures or adverse weather, but more a series of phases of greater or lesser intensity, such as the extreme years at the beginning of the 15th century, in the mid-1500s, the bitter cold of the 17th century, which saw the well-known frost fairs on the Thames, but which also saw the Tay freeze over as far downstream as Errol in its tidal estuary, or in the early 1800s, when ice formed on the Queensferry Narrows of the Forth. Amongst other phenomena that potentially added to the extreme effects of the NAO and ENSO are the episodes of exceptionally low sunspot activity referred to as solar minima. 5 appear to have played a role in some of the most profoundly negative episodes of Scotland's climate history between the later 13th and early 19th century. The Oort minimum, circa 1040 to 1080, the Wolf minimum, Spurrer minimum, the Maunder minimum, and the Dalton minimum. The physics of how exactly the reduced sunspot activity of such a minimum affected the key global climate drivers, like the El Niño-La Niña system in the Pacific or the AMOC in the North Atlantic, is still debated. A direct correlation between such minima and the extremely cold conditions experienced across the Northern Hemisphere, which coincided with them, has not yet been established firmly, but is strongly suspected. It is possible that their co-occurrence with periods of low NAO and weakened AMOC in an interplay of reduced solar radiation with the Earth's atmospheric and oceanic circulation combined to deepen already cooler, wetter, and more unsettled weather conditions into extremes of cold and precipitation. The solar minima themselves, however, were not unbroken episodes of poor conditions either, as is illustrated by less bad years from the 1660s to 1680s during the slide into the depths of the Maunder in the notorious 7 ill years of the 1690s. Nor had the century between the Spurrer and Maunder been a time of surplus or surfeit bathed in glorious weather, as the cyclonic storms of the late 16th century and famines of the 1600s, 1620s and 1630s likewise show. The interminimum weather conditions may have been less unfavourable than what came before or after, but the epidemics of the era, culminating in the high mortalities of the last Scottish plague outbreak in 1645-8, just as the Maunder minimum began, took any gloss off the human lived experience of these years. Our evidence for what would have been the lived experience or physical effects these various atmospheric and oceanic phenomena is derived mainly from proxy records. The most important long sequence proxy record is from the Greenland ice core data, and most of our temperatures and precipitation models for Scotland draw heavily on that. Obviously, Greenland is geographically distant from the northern British Isles, and there would have been considerable buffering effects of the intervening ocean. The development of geographically more proximate proxy sequences, therefore, has been of huge importance over the last 2 decades in enabling construction of more nuanced models. There are currently 3 main records widely available from Scotland. The Trallegill speleothem record, mainly for winter precipitation, the Loch Sunart bottom water temperature record, and the Cairngorm tree ring sequence, all of which are linked closest to weather patterns originating in the NAO. Of these proxies, only the Trallegill and Loch Sunart records extend currently into the deeper past, with the speleothems offering a 3 millennia deep record and the sediments 1 millennium. The Cairngorm data starts only in the early 13th century at present. The first of these proxies comes from Western Sutherland, in the record of the Wimantarter caves in the Trallegill Basin in Assynt here, where the growth rates of speleothems, stalagmites and stalactites, in the limestone caves reflect the annually deposited laminae of the speleothems, the levels of moisture percolating through from the peak overlying the subterranean system. Speleothems, the stalagmites and stalactites, offer a well-nuanced proxy record for winter precipitation with strong regional significance. For northwest Scotland, at least, the speleothems from Wimantarter have begun to yield good evidence for North Atlantic climate variability over a 3,000-year period and allow the construction of broad models of the winter climate regime experienced in Atlantic-facing northern Scotland. Wimantarter's record has been analysed in most detail for the 13th century and later, but the same kinds of trends of high versus low winter precipitation, revealing positive and negative NAO states, are identifiable for earlier centuries. The MCA sequence commences with 3 decades of high winter precipitation down to around 1030. This is associated with a high winter NAO that is characterised by strong westerly airflow and cyclonic rainfall, then plunges to the lowest precipitation, signalling a low winter NAO recorded for the Northwest Highlands until the early 17th century, with the dry conditions lasting into the 1080s. Low winter NAO is associated more with cold, dry winters and a northerly or easterly airflow, but the depth of the change reflected in the laminar growth of the speleothems at this point perhaps signals the additional influence of the Oort solar minimum. At Loch Sunart, the long, deep peninsula that penetrates, sea loch that penetrates the West Highland coast to the south of the Arnhem Peninsula, isotopic analysis of benthic invertebrates, clams, worms, and crustaceans from the bottom waters of the inlet yielded a record of summer coastal temperature anomalies spanning the last millennium. Their clearest evidence is of significant change in climate regime from around 1400, which the researchers saw as being driven by the large-scale reorganization of northern hemispheric atmospheric circulation that marked the transition into the LIA. In comparison with many other parts of Europe, and especially Ireland, Scotland has long lacked a long run of climate data derived from the annual growth ring of certain tree species. In the 1980s, preliminary research started to indicate that there was potential for the reconstruction of a sequence of historic summer temperatures in the Central Highlands using pine timbers rather than the oak that is the basis for the deep chronologies constructed for Ireland. But they ran into the barriers of the relatively young age of the majority of still-growing trees, around 225 years, and a lack of knowledge of the location of surviving structural timbers of greater age. In the early 2000s, however, there was a breakthrough using modern historical and subfossil pine material obtained from our current native pine woods, from historic structures, and from loch bed sediments. The material recovered spans the last 8,000 years. And we are fortunate that the published results of a first-stage analysis tree ring sequences from the Cairngorms commences circa 1200. These give us insight on summer conditions in the central and northeast Highland uplands over the last 800 years, taking us through the era from the decline of the MCA to the end of the LIA. As an illustration of the value of these proxies, let us look at just one short episode in the 13th century. For the Cairngorm tree ring sequence, we have a record of summers in this region having been generally cooler since the start of the century, declining slightly through the 1210s, but becoming significantly cooler through the 1220s. The extremes for that decade was reached in 1227, which was the fifth coldest year across the entire 800-year sequence currently available, but worse was to come. The extreme European winter of 1233-4 has been described as the most outstanding meteorological episode of the 13th century, and Scottish proxy data suggests that this was indeed a time of great cold. At Tralligill, the speleothem growth rings indicate that the 1230s were the driest decade of the 13th century, albeit with still relatively high levels of rain. What this points to is a marked weakening of winter NAO, which brought a much colder anticyclonic airflow, pulling Arctic air south and across Scotland. This cooling is present also as a sharp dip in the Loch Soonart deep water temperatures, followed by an equally sharp positive movement, perhaps pointing to a combination of cooler ocean surface temperatures and cold runoff from the surrounding land. In the Cairngorms, summer 1232 was the coldest of the last 800 years. Collectively, these fragments of evidence point to the late 1220s and early 1230s as a brief episode of sharply deteriorating summer and winter conditions, followed by a bounce back to the warmer conditions of previous decades. Taken together, this data provides some context for the political disturbance of this period, which saw King Alexander II facing challenges from the same northern and western regions that the proxies indicate experienced adverse weather conditions. Indeed, the King's campaigns in the Clyde Estuary, Sutherland and Caithness and Galloway were all hindered by adverse summer weather. So, to conclude the first lecture, let me return to the start of the late antique Little Ice Age and the transformed Scottish landscape of the 6th century. It was an already radically transformed cultural landscape that we find, but one that was yet to see some of the more profound changes that laid down the patterns still broadly recognizable today. While it was not so sharply compartmentalized, divided by hedges, dikes, and fences, as it became by the middle of the 19th century, when the Romans left in the 4th century, it was an open landscape of arable fields and pasture with limited stands of woodland that prevailed over much of the country. Denser forests persisted in some remoter and thinly populated districts, but as we shall explore later, these areas were also subject to modes of exploitation that rendered them at best semi-natural and most likely comprising regenerated growth on land that was subject to periodic grazing and possibly cultivation. The post-glacial wildwoods and the abundance of bird and animal life they had sustained were long gone. Most of the non-human predator species that had moved into this land in the wake of the ice, lynx and bears, for example, were extinct or nearly so, with the only remaining large predator, the wolf, already persecuted for the threat it was believed to pose to domesticated livestock and the competition they offered in the hunting of game, as it transitioned from being a hunter of the forest to a denizen of the open landscape. Herbivores, large and small, had also become more limited in their diversity, with the large woodland browsers perhaps most affected, but with smaller species like beavers seeing their habitats transformed by intensification of human exploitation of riverside tree species for material needs. The remaining semi-natural woods also still bore the distinctive imprint of past human management in their form and in the constitution of understory herbage, where species that thrived on disturbance or were spread through the actions of grazing domesticated animals had replaced the flora that had co-evolved with the woodland. And across the seemingly empty wastes in which they stood as islands of trees, the spread of blanket peat or expanses of impoverished grassland often signalled legacies from past efforts to stimulate pasture regeneration through burning or some other form of anthropogenic intervention, but which instead delivered unforeseen outcomes as climatic conditions brought waterlogging or helped to accelerate acidification of the soil. The brief exploration of the dynamics of climate change offered here in this first lecture, their interplay with human behaviours and the long, steady, slow violence of environmental degradation that was the most common outcome of that interplay, has served to introduce the cultural and natural factors that delivered the continuously shifting landscape we shall move on to explore. From recognition of the continuum that is climate and wider environmental change, and how such processes interact with and influence human behaviours, we can demystify and demythologize the manifold actions and processes that have led us to our present condition, and so arrive at a better understanding of the possible futures ahead. Thank you.